Greetings, friends. It's Michael Parker, and welcome back to Michael Parker Media. Today's story is one that's a bit alarming. It first appeared in the Wall Street Journal earlier this month. It was then picked up by various outlets, including today's guest, and it involves this incursion of drones over a cluster of military bases in Virginia, which is where our guest is coming from today. This Langley Air Force Base, which many of you will have heard of, you may not know that is also the center of potentially the most important military installations in the U.S. We'll cover that. Langley Air Force Base and its associated installations. These drone incursions went on for an astonishing 17 nights in December of 2023. Our guest today is retired Colonel John Mills. He is a national security professional. He is the former director of cybersecurity policy, strategy, and international affairs at the Department of Defense. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. His most recent book is War Against the Deep State. He has 35 years of service to the United States of America. We're honored and pleased to have him on the show. Welcome, Colonel Mills.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor to be on the show.
I appreciate it. So, as I mentioned in the intro, I didn't hear about this until earlier this month, and I think I keep my ear pretty close to the ground. And what this involved was a drone incursion of 17 nights over Langley Air Force Base. It was reported by the Wall Street Journal. You picked it up, and some other people did. So, first of all, just so people understand the gravity of this, tell us what is in that area besides just Langley Air Force Base.
Well, this is the largest cluster of Department of Defense, and there's also other government agencies involved in this area. This is the largest cluster of DoD and other government agencies' activities in the world, and probably the largest cluster of military installations in the entire world, considering all other military services of other nations. So this is a huge cluster and congregation of American military power. So this is very concerning. It goes all the way, if everybody can visualize, the Williamsburg Peninsula, Williamsburg being kind of the historical attraction that many often come to in Virginia. But you got Camp Perry up in the top left, which is a facility for another government agency. And then you keep going. Then you got Cheatham Annex, which is a very important supply base for the Navy. And then you have Yorktown Naval Weapons Station. That's where all the bombs and missiles for the entire U.S. Navy East Coast, that's where they're stored when they're not at ships or undergoing maintenance or some other thing. Very likely, we're redoing that facility to re-accept nuclear warheads, the W-80 for the Tomahawk cruise missile, which is mandated. The Biden team fought this, but a very, very necessary capability. And then you get Langley Air Force Base, but across from Langley, you also get Fort Eustis.
Let me interrupt. Here's what you mentioned in your article. Langley Air Force Base, this also includes Fort Eustis, Yorktown Naval Weapons Station, Norfolk Naval Station, Norfolk Naval Air Station, Little Creek Amphibious Base, Oceana Naval Air Station, and Dam Neck Annex, which I guess that is the home of SEAL Team 6?
I don't know. The Navy says something called Dev Group is there. The Navy does not acknowledge who is at what, especially when it comes to the Special Warfare Team. So that's where Development Group, a Special Warfare Development Group is at.
Okay. Well, it is an extremely important place. So a lot of people are going to say, okay, A, how could this happen? B, where did they come from? C, why were they not intercepted? And D, what are the implications for United States security? And let's just talk about these drones. What can you tell us about the drones themselves?
Well, you had, I think it was 4 questions, and I think it's almost simpler to start with the last one first.
Okay.
The impact is we don't have an unsecure border only. We have an unsecure interior. Now, there are a few who have said this is maybe a UFO situation. This was not a UFO situation. This was a hostile foreign power. This was very complex. And they were doing it right over our largest cluster of military facilities in the world. This is extremely alarming. And what did we do about it for 17 nights? Well, clearly nothing. And people go, oh, you just shoot them down. It's a little more complex than that. Okay. This is not Iraq. This is not Syria, where we just open up with the Centurion Gatling gun and gun them down. Does anybody want a Gatling gun being fired over their house? I don't think so. Does anybody want a missile being fired and exploded over their house? I don't think so. That's not a good idea. And say, well, you just use electronic warfare to just jam it. Well, do you want the electronics in your home fried also? I mean, this is a very complicated issue, and somebody, I think it most likely traces to China, might have been done by a surrogate such as Iran. Iran is a colony of China at this point in time. So and it's so very complex. Now, having worked at the White House and spent time at the White House, I kind of know how these crises spin up, and I can just visualize the interagency team being hastily assembled at the White House from the different departments and agencies, and the mind-numbing bickering that goes on as
Yes.
everybody tries to figure out roles and missions. Whose job is this? And the reality is, it's not really anybody's job. But this is playing gaps and seams. And this is what concerns me about China. China reads our laws better than we do. And they understand roles and missions and the law. They actually understand it better than we do. They stopped stealing our classified stuff. They started reading our laws and they understand gaps and seams. The reality is, four departments have partial responsibilities inside the domestic United States, starting with the Department of Defense, but that's actually just for a sliver of DoD facilities, not all of them. And there's really essentially only two. I'm not going to name which ones those are, but it's not these ones. Okay. So that's one of the challenges. Then you also have Department of Energy. They have some responsibility and authority to knock down a drone. That's only over the Nevada nuclear test site, where we are actually, it looks like we're preparing to restart underground nuclear testing. Why is that? It's because China is out of control on their nuclear buildup. Okay, so that's just at the Nevada nuclear test site. Then you have Department of Justice and DHS kind of share some responsibilities, but those are primarily for what are national security events like the Super Bowl, like the State of the Union address, and things like that. So this situation doesn't really fit any of those other standing legal authorities. This is a problem. I think I cited in my article, there's a great Congressional Research Service release on exactly this issue. We have four departments and agencies that have little piece parts of the issue, but right now, for 17 days, I can just imagine the squabbling in the White House as everybody tried to figure out whose job is this? Because the DoD can't literally engage beyond the physics. So just draw a vertical line up from their fence line. They can't do anything about it. Guess what? This never actually flew over the airfield. It came right up to the airfield. It did not fly over the airfield. That's expressing an understanding of roles and missions and legal authorities. DoD can't do anything unless it crosses that invisible line. Again, just draw a vertical line up from the fence line. If I cross that fence line, totally different game. Doesn't cross the fence line, DoD can't really do is not allowed to do anything about it. This is crazy. But for 17 days, now the description of one Air Force general who went up to one of the roofs, it almost sounded like something out of a 50s sci-fi movie. But again, this was not UFOs. This was not UFOs. And so the general described, now he's an aviator, so I trust his word, but it was a little bit of an interesting description. He described a fixed wing drone, meaning like an airplane type drone, 20 feet long, traveling at 100 miles an hour at 3,000 feet. Wow. You just start doing the physics of this and start doing the basic calculus. And I'm going, that's a lot of weight. That's a lot of mass at a high speed, at a high altitude. That's not your normal consumer drone or hobby drone. But then he talked that it was essentially seen to be interacting and shepherding a group of much larger quadcopters. People know that the Chinese DJI drone that's sold at a lot of places, including Costco. These were not DJI drones. These were almost farm grade or for agricultural purpose drones. These are much larger drones, have a much larger lift capacity, endurance. Now, the one thing I find kind of interesting, it's rare to find an interaction with a fixed wing drone and large quadcopters, just two different flight characteristics. I'll take the general's word for it. I mean, he's an aviator, but it's just an interesting, and it's almost like it was a command and control airborne asset leading around these drones. And it also brings into other aspects. They advanced artificial intelligence, where they were essentially able to collaborate with each other without bumping into each other. That's a significant accomplishment. So it's not some human with a joystick sitting here flying each one of these drones. That's where you need AI to coordinate the flight movements of this swarm of air vehicles. It ain't going to work. So it
Uh,
implies AI, it implies communication, it implies maybe contact with low Earth orbit satellites.
well, what? Just one point. Now, I read the account. I believe his name was Mark Kelly, Colonel Mark
Yes,
Kelly.
yes,
Okay,
yes, yes.
so and he went up on the roof. He witnessed this, and I'm with you. I agree. I believe the man. Now, what I thought they said though was that there was the large fixed wing, which was 20 feet long, as you described it. But I thought the quadcopters were more kind of commercial grade, smaller quadcopters.
Well, there were some other adjectival descriptions that, a small DJI drone, which is part of the interesting story. 2 months later, a Chinese national
Yes.
was arrested for flying a DJI small drone over Newport News shipbuilding, which we left
Yes.
out of that description. The largest American shipyard. That's where we make our nuclear aircraft carriers, and essentially half of our literally half half of the length of our nuclear submarines. Then they're mated with the other half up in Connecticut. Um, a little DJI drone is not going to have the altitude, the performance to anywhere keep up or interact with a larger drone flying at that altitude.
That makes sense to me. And in the articles that I read, they were saying, 100 kilometers. I was like, okay, what is that? And I think it was 60 miles per hour, but still 3,000 to 4,000 feet. Then you've got these others that are being escorted into the space. Where do you think they took off from?
You remember in Indiana Jones where they at the end of the very last scene where we have our top people working on this. I hope
Mhm.
we have our top people working on this. This is not that complicated, but you
Colonel,
know,
that is precisely, I mean, I think that's the largest issue to me of all of this. And we're going to return to that is the bureaucratic issues surrounding all of this. But just to talk about the drones for just a little bit more, because yes, I've heard the UFO stories. And listen, I'm a UFO enthusiast. I follow those stories. But it seems like that we know that these drones were using non-commercial frequencies to communicate. How do we know that?
wow, that's good for you. I think that I would maybe tweak that description, but I like that description is non-standard unexpected frequencies
Okay,
because
cool.
the FCC dominates international bandwidth usage. Why? Because hey, we just developed most of this, and it wasn't until the Clinton years when we realized, hey, commercial, DoD dominated 90% of the bandwidth and we were using it very inefficiently. So, hey, let's start selling off in the beginning of the internet and wireless era. Okay. But I would say that what you brought up was a very interesting point was non-standard unexpected frequencies. Because there is kind of a dictate from FCC on the general, like if it's a VHF, if it's cell phone, you use this. And we're kind of conditioned to look for somebody misusing frequencies within those frequencies. Now, if somebody is being clever and using frequency hopping, very sophisticated, but very possible. It's a lot. I'm just suggesting, I don't know this for sure, but our ability to detect frequency hopping is probably not good at the tactical level. That kind of starts to take advanced knowledge, NSA like capabilities. So, some kind of tactical exploit team, I have lower confidence that they would able to detect frequency hopping. And that's where you have to have your timing down. And that's where you are hopping boop, 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 between different frequencies. And that makes it really hard to follow, monitor, and jam because you got to have the timing down and you got to know what frequency you're hopping between because that's essentially a complex algorithm. I'm going to have to crunch it and break it. I don't even know what frequencies there. So that's really going to kind of take national level capabilities at fixed locations to really, take. That's a hard problem set to crack in the field.
You
So
mentioned you mentioned that because a lot of people, civilians who are just hearing about this are like, okay, why didn't we take them down? As you pointed out earlier, you say that that's actually quite easy. So going forward, let's just say we get the bureaucracy sorted out, which I don't have great confidence in. How would we intercept these going forward? in a situation like this?
We'd have to have a more pervasive and mature deployable capability or already set up in some of these base clusters to detect and take on something like this. I think they understood our gaps and seams and were playing us. Now, I didn't answer your question. Where did they launch from?
Yeah.
This is where, again, I think it was a foreign power, but aided and abetted by the insider, which they had people on the ground helping them. And remember, in uniform and in civilians, we take an oath of office to defend, uphold, and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Somebody was likely helping them out. Somebody, because you need a launch site. Draw a lot. My rough estimate for the quadcopters, it would have had to have been within 60 miles. So just find Langley on the map, draw a circle 60 miles out. That's where your search begins. Okay. And that area, there's a lot of rural area. There's lots of heavily forested areas. But hey, you drop off a shipping container back there, and shipping containers are wonderful for clandestine activities.
Yes.
You can hide all kinds of stuff in a ratty looking container. Next thing you know, it's kind of pre-aged at, like at some antique store, but it's really sparkling brand new on the inside. The top opens up. I mean, you can launch straight from inside the 20 or 40 or 48 foot unit. You can recharge, you can do all your maintenance, and that top just closes when you don't need to have it open, and nobody even knows what it is. It just looks like a ratty old container.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, because I didn't expect you to say that. I thought that they would probably be launched from sea.
That would be too obvious.
Okay.
I mean, that would be
Good
the
answer.
shipping. Yes and no. It's actually not totally, but that's pretty mature for somebody to start doing flight activity like that. Those are pretty mature sea lanes. So let's say it was a container, because I've been at Fort Story and I know all the routes coming in and out of the Virginia Capes and entry to the Chesapeake. I think it would be obvious pretty quick. Somebody would notice something.
Understood. So one of the things that I read was that one of the things that they were initially thinking, because you mentioned jamming them or potentially shooting them, and I thought that I read that they even considered the possibility of the Coast Guard shooting nets at them, which seems that implies that they were over water.
Yeah, I read that too. And it's like, I'm sorry, I don't know of any net shooting gun that
Right.
the Coast Guard has deployed. If somebody knows the make and model and manufacture of a this is not the 1880s here.
Man, like. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it sounds interesting. I don't think that has a national stock number and is not a real thing. Interesting point. Yeah, somebody get back to me on the net throwing nomenclature. I don't think that exists. And people go, well, just create a gun that shoots a net.
Right.
Okay, this is not comic books here. This is reality. Let's get real. So there has been some research in nets, but got to do the physics again. When something's moving at even the slower quadcopters, they're moving at maybe 60 miles an hour, at 1,000 feet. Just do the physics on throwing a net to that high. And still, you throw a 20 by 20 weighted net into the air, it's going to land somewhere. Do you
Colonel,
want that landing on your house?
Yeah, I'm with you. I found that far-fetched. The only thing that I took away from it was that they were saying that this was over water. Your idea that they were launched from land inside the United States is particularly disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, the container hidden on a container ship is of concern, but I think it's less likely. I'm not sweeping it off the evidence table, but I would focus more on the land. I also surmise that the fixed wing drone likely took off from a different location. You have a launch site for the drone, for the quadcopters. You have a launch site for the fixed wing. Why? It's too much activity in one location. You want to hide it a little better. So everybody says, okay, guys, here's tonight's plan. We're going to have the quadcopters and the fixed wing meet at this location. Let's start doing the math on how, when do I have to take off to meet the fixed wing drone at this time, at this location. You're going to need a little bit of an airstrip, which still could be hidden somewhere, but you're going to probably need about a 300-foot airstrip. That's going to start to be a little more obvious. Now, one of the things, the FBI has a fairly substantial air fleet. It's not well known, but just do a modicum of internet research. You'll come up with stories on it.
That makes sense.
Oh, yeah. They have a pretty healthy air fleet. Not saying it's always being used for the right reasons. Unfortunately, they're spending more time monitoring parents at school board meetings than doing what they should be doing.
Amen.
But I would have immediately, one of the interagency actions, as the bureaucrats argued at the White House, is they should have immediately repurposed some of the local FBI flight detachments to, because they have some, if nothing else, some of the infrared sensors that could pick up the flight activity at night, might have some of the might have some special kits that they might be able to detect frequency hopping, but get those suckers in the air and get them. But one thing, it's also a safety of flight issue. You don't want to put an FBI flight crew, send them right into the heart of a, these are unpredictable flight activities by this drone swarm. So you got to be a little careful about sending a manned resource right into the center, because you're going to have an in-flight collision that's not going to turn out well for the flight crew.
I'm still blown away that this could be 17 nights in a row. And the article says that these happened approximately 45 minutes to an hour after sundown. And then it goes for 17 nights in a row. What do you think was happening on the ground in real time? Because we clearly didn't respond in a way to intercept them for the reasons that you've mentioned that we'll revisit later. What do you think was happening at these bases while this was going on?
It's called a flap X, where everybody runs around flapping their wings, trying to figure out what to do. That's 90% of your time in the government. So
Yeah.
it would have been chaos. And one thing I think the article did say, they scrambled and got all the F-22s out of there. These are high value assets. You want to protect them. You're not going to use an F-22 to take on a drone swarm like this. Your first step, get them out of there, because we don't have a whole lot of the F-22s. You don't want them damaged, so get them out of there. Same thing for Oceana. I don't think it mentioned Oceana, but those are all the fighter aircraft for the Navy on the East Coast. I hope they scrambled and got those out of there. Those are sitting ducks on the ground. That's bad stuff. I hope they would have scrambled some of the Navy ships at Norfolk Navy Base. Everybody just look up Norfolk Navy Base and some of the promotional photos, and you'll see all the East Coast ships tied up nice and neat. Looks like Battleship Row in 1941 at Pearl Harbor. I mean, that quadcopter flies over that line of ships, starts dropping thermite grenades, sets those ships on fire. It's over. I hope they scrambled some of the ships and got them out of there.
Well, my next question, I guess, would be, we see them coming in. We know how many there are roughly, because it would look like there was the 120-foot fixed wing and then around a dozen of the quadcopters. So I would think that we would have some data on where they, at least what direction they return to.
Yeah, the article was silent on that. If I was handed this problem set, the first thing I'd do is draw a circle from the first known location, which was Langley. For everybody's information, these didn't necessarily fly over any DoD installation, which also tells me that they were savvy enough to understand the laws and regulations of the United States. They flew close to, but they didn't fly over. That's, I think, intentional. So the first thing I would have done is taken Langley and drawn a circle 60 miles to kind of figure it out. And anytime we detected an assembly 17 nights in a row, as soon as, that hour and a half after sundown came, as soon as we detected it, first known report, I would have, plotted it and drawn that 60-mile circle, because understood. That's a rough approximation. But you do several of those circles, then you start to get overlapping space, and you start to go, okay, I'm going to narrow down the search even more to right here, where I start to see these circles, all these circles overlapping, the overlapping space, because then that's going to start to help me understand a possible launch site. Again, the fixed wing is a little bit of a wild card, because that would have longer range. So you could put that even further away from the whole area. So that's a little bit of a harder one. But let's get the quadcopters first.
Yes.
So that's basically how I would have, started biting this elephant one bite at a time and trying to figure it out. Because this is crazy. But the reality is, somebody understood our gaps and seams and was playing us in December. And when the article did first come out, there was several articles. War Zone is a great journal.
Yes.
They came out with an article, but it was almost zero details. Some, drone swarm. Okay, so what? Next story. I go, okay, this is like, something's going on here.
The major situation, because I believe a month or two earlier, we had 5 drones over a nuclear site in Nevada. You mentioned a month later, we had the young Chinese national student, Feng Yanxi or something, I believe is the kid's name. He was getting ready to return to China, and he was using a commercial drone to take pictures, I believe, of a naval yard. And then a month later, we have the infamous Chinese weather balloon, spy balloon. I mean, this is an ongoing situation of great importance.
Okay, yeah, the spy balloon was February of 23.
Yes.
Okay, the drone swarm was December of 23.
Correct.
And then the Chinese national
24.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the event happened in December. There was some nominal reporting, but then all of a sudden the Wall Street Journal comes out with this detailed report. This doesn't come out of thin air. So it looks like the White House selectively chose the Wall Street Journal to be the one that received the goods on. It's going to take several months of interagency analysis. And again, this is what happens. Okay, something happened. What does it mean? What do we do about it? And it takes a number of months. This is just like Volt Typhoon, the first Chinese cyber attack, which was reported May of 23, but it was Microsoft and it was very vague report. And then by the end of the year, you've got DHS, NSA, and FBI going, alarm bells are flashing everywhere. It takes time for the interagency to come up with their synthesized position and then release it and start giving guidance and directions. We've done this before where we said, okay, we're going to call in Umpty-Ump and do the reveal first with them. I don't think I saw that in the article. I don't think I saw anything about according to an unnamed source, which with the current administration usually means Jake Sullivan at the White House.
Well, you actually predicted one of the questions I was going to ask is why are we hearing about this now, 10 months after the incident? And if the White House chose the Wall Street Journal to create a detailed article, which does not surprise me, what are they telling us by the release of this information at this time?
Well, there's several reasons. One, there are some white hats still left inside the U.S. government. it's the right thing to do. We tell the truth to the American people. But you also want to selectively, because you also want to see who reacts to the story. And so that's where you're going to see, because they're probably watching certain things and certain groups and certain news to see how they react to the story, because they're trying to ferret out who was in on this. So they're trying to see, and I'm not going to name any other places, but they're going to say, okay, who says what in response to this article? It's just like China, when they took over Hong Kong and crushed the opposition in Hong Kong, violating an international treaty, using COVID scam as the reason for crushing and taking over Hong Kong like 20 years early. They took over the South China Morning Post, which was Rupert Murdoch's paper, which for over 100 years had been considered the paper of Asia. Well, now that it's under Chinese Communist Party control, they use the South China Morning Post to essentially run a story up the flagpole and see who reacts to it. Okay? Because they're using that essentially as a trial balloon on their talking points, on their themes. So that's how they're using the South China Morning Post. Same applies here, where in some ways the Wall Street Journal is the sounding board and the government's going to share with them. They run the story. Let's see who reacts and says what about it. And because they're really keeping their eyes open to see if there's any indicators that would tip off who might have had something to do with this. So that's part of the game that's going on.
So after this happened, apparently, various meetings were held. They are sitting and talking and trying to figure out what we're going to do, what happened. Do you think that any progress has been made since that time to avert these incursions in the future?
We are essentially at war with China right now. Everybody goes, I know what you're talking about.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know. There's no bombs or missiles. We're only stepping over the dead bodies of 10,000 Americans a month killed by Chinese fentanyl. If that's not war, I frankly don't know what is. In 1 year, and this has been going on for multiple years, we've lost more Americans dead than were lost in the entire Korean War, plus the entire Vietnam War, plus the entire war on terror together in 1 year dead from Chinese fentanyl. And that's not war. I frankly, I don't know what to say if somebody doesn't find that compelling. So war has many different manifestations. It's not just bombs and missiles. And China is trying to topple us. And so we are in a state of conflict. And so we have to start acting like it. I put out an article almost a year ago in Epic Times that got a lot of attention. It exploded. And it was essentially the article was the Department of Defense is not ready for conflict. We need to disperse, camouflage, and harden our base activities. I think a lot of people at the DoD read this article. This is what you got to do. If we're in a state of conflict, this is Pearl Harbor all over again. You don't line up all your aircraft wingtip to wingtip because it's easier for the guards to watch the aircraft. That's not necessarily the threat. You've just made it much easier for the targeteer. Well, I don't need to use 10 aircraft to take out this airfield. All I need is one aircraft to do a nice strafing run and it's over because you've lined up all the aircraft for me. Thank you very much, U.S. Army, Air Corps, and U.S. Navy. So this is disperse, camouflage, harden. And I think I've started to see generals and admirals talk about this. And we're dispersing bases along the second island chain. We're reopening bases that have been closed essentially since the Second World War because we realize we need to disperse our forces. And that's what I'm talking about: Guam, Tinian, Saipan, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia. We're starting to, on sovereign American territory and with our partner nations, reopen and disperse our base activities.
When you're describing all this, one thing that just popped into my head is that, and you feel pretty confident that this is a foreign state like China or a proxy Iran. But one question that popped in my head is like, I would think that, and this is the motivation, I'm trying to get to the motivation of the drone storm. What were they trying to do? Because I would think that some of the data that you could get, you could get through satellite imagery. So it almost makes me feel like part of the reason they did this is to see what we would do.
Oh, absolutely. Testing us. They're testing us, but it also gives you more tactical, granular intelligence because you got to remember, just like with the DJI drone that somebody will buy again at Costco, which I've asked several times to stop carrying, is at a minimum collects and transmits 200 distinct data elements every time you turn rotors. It collects and transmits them because you've also authenticated your personal phone to the DJI network in Shenzhen, China. So all your ones and zeros from your cell phone and all those ones, and you got to imagine the DJI small drone is just consumer drone. It's a flying vacuum cleaner of a flight data recorder, the old black box on an aircraft. Well, now, I mean, black boxes are not what they used to be. It's not like, well, here's the airspeed, here's the azimuth. No, I mean, those things can collect hundreds and hundreds of data elements that can be reported back because the company often finds, hey, there's a lot of data I can use to analyze and improve my flight activity and my commercial on my aircraft. Same thing applies here, except why do we have the DJI drone collecting temperatures? Why do we have the DJI drone transmitting, essentially mapping geography using the cell phone strength and strength of transmission, and also digitally fingerprinting them? Because every one of these cell phone towers has a distinct digital fingerprint. Why is the DJI drone, collecting audio, whether you like it or not? Why is it transmitting all this audio back to China? I mean, this is incredible. This is rich data and data analytics that can be used by artificial intelligence. And that's, again, I mentioned at the beginning, very likely the fixed wing drone and the quadcopters were working AI enabled to work with each other. They were communicating through low Earth orbit satellites. So they weren't even using the cell phone network. They were using the cell phone networks because that helped them map the terrain and the geography. But anything they were transmitting was very possibly going up to a low Earth orbit satellite, the Chinese LEO constellation, boop, 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 communicate, send to each other. and then send it back down to the ground station inside of China, totally bypassing the American ground network, the American high satellites. So again, this is almost digitally and electronically, it's almost invisible to our what we possibly have out there as capabilities to detect.
So drone technology is not new. We've had this quite a while, and commercial grade drones have been readily available, I would say at least 10 years. Why have we not developed some form of protocol to deal with this subject? Because this is the 21st century. I believe the FAA says that there are at least 100 reported drones by pilots each month. And then I went and downloaded this PDF Excel file, and it was astonishing. You could go by city, and then there's a brief description of the drone. Some were silver, some were black, et cetera, over these various cities. I live in Los Angeles, so I was looking at Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, the most recent report, Chicago was off the charts for the amount of described drone activity. But why has it taken us this long to address what seems to be such a obvious issue?
You know, the FAA is not well funded. I'll be honest to start off with. The FAA is not robustly funded. The FAA, and again, in the domestic airspace, it's a partnership between the Federal Aviation Administration, NASA's doing some of the deep research for FAA, because FAA doesn't have a deep technical bench to do research.
Colonel, let
And
me
then
just
it's
I'm not picking a fight with FAA. I'm just wondering more on the governmental side. I would think it would be these agencies that you were talking about at the top. Why have they not developed some form of a protocol and interagency? And who should lead it if we did that?
Well, that's exactly it. I believe the FAA is the lead agency at the White House for
Hmm.
working. They are. And that's
Okay.
what everybody's going to point at somebody else, because if you take responsibility for some problem set, the next question is, what's your budget for it? And your answer is going to be, I don't have any budget for this. Well, I'm not going to eat it out of high. And the FAA is nominally funded with the next Trump administration. That's one thing we should address, is more robustly fund the FAA. I mean, we haven't had a major air crash since Jamaica Bay in 2001. Pretty good track record of safety for the large commercial airliners. But the reality is, this is everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else, because the second you take responsibility, okay, fine, you got it, but I don't have budget for it. No, too late. You already said it's yours. Um, this is the way we got to figure this outside the U.S. government.
So, in short, you are saying this should be the responsibility, and FAA should be the one taking the lead on this in the future if we could get it sorted out.
Well, it's going to be a partnership. I think at the top, the FAA is the logical organization. However, the FAA should not be the one responsible for
Responding.
engaging and downing a non-compliant drone. For air traffic procedures, yes, FAA. For air traffic policy, FAA. Dealing with a hostile or non-compliant, no, that's not FAA's job. That's where it starts to get Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Justice. That's where it is a complex thing. But the reality is, we haven't worked out these procedures yet. It's just not been an issue.
One last question, and then we'll wrap this thing up. What has been the scuttlebutt amongst people that you know in service regarding this story? Have you heard much, or has it been the topic of discussion?
Well, we just got so many black swan events going on. I think people are getting black swan fatigue. And so it's a conveyor belt of black swans. And so I think another Wall Street Journal article just came out and said the breadth and depth of the Chinese offensive intelligence campaign is overwhelming the entire West. I think that's one of the things that's going on here. Even during the Cold War with the Soviets, we didn't face such an immense, because the Soviet economy was and is, they're roughly a $1 trillion GDP. We're 20 to 30 trillion. We don't even know. We can't even get accurate financial numbers anymore. China is probably is smaller than our economy, but still they're 20 times the size. We're dealing with somebody who's 20 times the resources of what the Soviets and now the Russians have. So This is on a scale we've never had to deal with before. Even during the darkest days of the Cold War, we had a much larger economy, and the Soviets tried to scare us with all their missiles. But in the end, we put them out of business through Reagan, who said we're going to bankrupt them, and we did. The Chinese are a different game.
Colonel Mills, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show today. I know that you have multiple books, and you have one about the deep state, your most recent book. So I'd like to have you back to discuss that, because some people, I think, still think that the deep state is a catchphrase and it is a real thing. So I'd love to speak with you about that. But tell people where they can find you on the internet, your X account, your Substack, et cetera.
Oh, thank you, Michael. So I am Colonel Rhett John, Colonel RET John 2 at X. I'm Colonel Rhett John, no, number 2, just Colonel Rhett John at Substack, also Getter and Truth. Colonel Rhett John on Substack, Getter and Truth. And I'm in a bunch of different medias. You'll see me on a number of different channels and shows. Thank you, Michael.
Well, I appreciate your service and I appreciate your time today. I will put those links in the body of the description of this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we're doing here and you find this important and entertaining and informing, it would mean the world for me if you could just reach out to some friends or family and share these podcasts, share these videos, give us a thumbs up, give us a like, please give us a subscription if you could, and I would really appreciate that. And I appreciate all of you who listen. And until next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.